Okay, ready, start.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Wu, and I am Executive Director of Social Impact at Mind. So this month, we are having conversations around AAPI community, the Asian American Pacific Islander community. And we thought a really good idea would be to actually interview a generation other than ourselves experiencing being Asian Americans in this country. So I decided to interview my own daughter, Angela.
Hi, I'm Angela.
um, and yeah, so this is just a casual conversation, and we hope you enjoy it. So, Angela, my coworkers kind of gave me some prompt questions that they were curious about in terms of your experience growing up, half Asian American in
Right.
this country. So, tell everybody what was it like for you? Just how old you are now, and what was it like for you growing up Asian American?
Growing up half Asian American, as my experience is probably a little bit different than all of my fellow Asian Americans. It was definitely very apparent for me and my sister growing up because we grew up in a pretty white community. In fact, we were probably one of the few Asian kids in our classes growing up. And the experience was interesting because we grew up in such a white community that we didn't really know the racial differences. We didn't really realize that we were something called Chinese or we were something called white. So I honestly didn't really feel that many biases towards me, like in terms of being half Asian and whatnot. Maybe some kids threw a comment at me once in a while when I was in elementary school, but for the most part, Christina and I just happened to be slightly different looking than everybody else.
Yeah,
And I don't know. I honestly think it was a perfectly fine childhood where we grew up.
yeah. Um, I think that this was in Redmond, Washington, near Seattle. So the neighborhood was diverse.
Hmm.
The school district itself was primarily white.
Hmm.
But, in general, the area was pretty well educated. But I actually remember Christina coming home one time and saying that, the neighbor boy called her a mutt. And, and she was like, mommy, he called me a mutt. I don't know what that was about. And for me, I immediately got
Yeah.
defensive, because I'm like, is he referring to the fact that you're biracial?
Right.
So I think that in some ways, maybe like you guys didn't really experience the discrimination because it wasn't that.
I mean, any discrimination towards us would come as half.
Yeah,
It would come as much, much less aggressive and much less biting as any
yeah,
other racial discrimination. So Christina and I were definitely a lot more fortunate than some other students that we might have had in class. But Christina seemed to be getting the brunt of the comments because I remember you also said that when she was in elementary school, she came home and she was upset because she didn't have pretty blonde hair and pretty
yeah,
blue eyes that the other girls had. So from a feminine experience, like just being a girl growing up as half Asian and whatnot, I think the experience was definitely a lot more pronounced towards beauty and physical like attributes and whatnot, like having blue eyes or having blonde hair. So Christina and I were definitely a lot more attuned to that rather than any racial comments about our heritage and more about like, are we too tan? Are we not tan enough? Our eyebrows too thin? Are they not thick enough? It was always the scrutinizing details that really got us.
yeah. I do remember her coming home and commenting about that. And when you were little, you were always more like independent and didn't really care what other people thought. So
I call myself a mutt now for fun. Like mutt might have been an insult back then, but now I'm just like quite fine with referring to myself as that.
yeah, yeah. But Asian Americans do experience stereotypes,
Right.
and especially being like the considered the Asian, what do they call it, the model minority, because we are supposed to do everything right, be
Hmm.
good students, be hard workers.
Hmm.
So for you, did you experience or did you have awareness of, what some of their stereotypes were?
Oh, I mean, there's plenty of awareness just from media, TV, movies, like anything that you grew up with, and they might throw those jokes here and there, like, oh, for this math project, we want the Asian on our team. It's like
Yeah,
there's plenty of fun jokes to toss around. But yeah, that was pretty much like the base of the jokes. There it was just like all these little like little slip in, little biting kind of like meh jokes that
yeah,
were funny to everybody, but maybe not so funny to your Asian classmates.
yeah.
That was definitely where it was most pronounced.
Was it, hard for you not being good at math growing up? On top of it just being hard, not being able to get the math,
Hmm.
was it hard being an Asian student that didn't fit their stereotype?
Nope. I wish that was the case, but I mean, if anything, that might have actually helped with my grades a little bit, but it didn't. Well, because I'm half, and I don't want to keep, harping on this point, but I don't think a lot of people knew what I was.
Mm,
Like being in a white school, I was brown.
yeah.
Like some people thought maybe she's Mexican, maybe she's Filipino. Like a lot of people who did know me could see the woo in my name, so they knew that I was Asian. But for the most part, I didn't really see anybody pushing that stereotype on me. But I'm sure, like for an example, I would totally believe that somebody might have been pushing that stereotype on Kimberly Purdue. Kimberly Purdue at my class, she was Japanese and she was the class president, the leader of the board. She was always
Yeah.
like, she always
But she's
felt,
also half.
is she?
Yeah.
Oh my
You
god.
know her. Yes.
I totally forgot about that. See, that's how
Yeah.
blind I am to that sort of thing. I totally forgot about that aspect of her. But she definitely
Yeah.
always
She
like
fit the stereotype
she did
though.
fit the stereotype of
Yeah.
constantly being like, it's my job to be at the top of
Yeah.
the top of the top. And yeah, I was far too
And she's
lazy.
still like that. She's amazing.
I know,
I
she's
love
incredible.
seeing what she's accomplished.
Mhm,
She's awesome.
mhm.
So at home, I wanted to speak, Chinese and Portuguese
Right.
because, I grew up in Brazil. For those of you who don't know, I grew up in Brazil, even though my parents are Chinese. So Portuguese and Chinese was always spoken for me growing up. And then for you guys, because I was working all the time, I
Mhm,
just couldn't, spend enough time speaking Chinese or Portuguese with you. So
mhm.
you ended up growing up speaking English, but
Yeah.
now you're learning Chinese from Popo, from
Yes.
grandma. So why are you doing that? And why is it important for you to speak Chinese?
It's like growing right now, I'm at a very young age. I'm in my early 20s, and I honestly feel like a really big reason might be partially selfish. It's just kind of about building my identity. And a big part of my identity is being half Chinese and just wanting to be a part of that culture. And I don't necessarily want to be two-faced. I don't want to have to switch back and forth all the time. But I do really want to establish that part of my identity in order to, like make it
Yeah,
known and just like having that ability to communicate with my family members who live in Taiwan, something as simple as that. I definitely don't want to watch my grandparents, my Chinese grandparents, be saddened by their grandchildren slipping farther and farther away from the heritage. So I have time. I have a brain.
good.
So I don't see any reason why I can't just really implement that in my daily learning, just learning Chinese and Japanese, like learning any Asian language, but mostly just as a sort of like personal duty to my heritage and my grandparents.
Tell me a little bit more about that feeling of being two-faced or having to switch back and forth.
Oh, it's very real.
What is? And tell me more. When does that
Mhm.
manifest, and how does that affect your learning about yourself and growing
Yeah.
up?
It's funny. I was actually just thinking about this recently. That ability to switch back and forth to adapt culturally to different people, I really think it's partially a survival mechanism. I think
Mhm.
that anybody who has been struggling with networking and trying to be like, a very productive socialite, it's a really good skill to practice to be able to adapt yourself to different cultures and whatnot so that you're able to, one, never offend anyone,
Yeah,
like never offend anybody and do your research and try and be like very open to all different cultures and all different races and ethnicities. And that's just a really important part of my personality is I really want to be able to connect with lots of different kinds of people. And
yeah,
so not just for myself, but being able to connect with my Chinese relatives in Taiwan, but just for everybody, being able to connect with any East Asian race or other race, like for example, um, I think a lot of people might be aware that there's a lot of current struggles right now between Japanese, South Korean, and Taiwanese and Chinese culture because of the historical rifts that have really torn them apart. And it might seem a little too like grandiose or heroic, but I would love to be able to kind of bridge this
yeah.
because it's kind of sad the notion that like these this hatred for like various different races and stuff might get passed down over and over. So I kind of like feel it as my own responsibility to be able to educate myself about others' cultures and being able to learn their languages and stuff.
Yeah,
Literally learn the language
yeah.
so I can connect with everybody.
That's awesome. Yeah, I know what you're talking about because so my parents, your
Mhm.
grandparents, actually grew up at the end of World War II.
Right.
So, and
So
they were in the military, so they had very strong feelings about the different conflicts in
mhm.
the region. And of course, they pass some of that on to me.
Mhm.
And I hope I didn't pass on too much to you, but it's inevitable, that some of the historical context will pass down. But I love it that I like seeing you watch the Korean
Oh yeah,
shows.
K-dramas. I love K-drama.
Dramas are awesome.
Yeah, no, there's
Who
there's
doesn't love them?
there's so
Yeah,
many like fantastic things from each culture that I want to like
yeah.
enjoy. Like I love anime.
And
I
with
love Studio
yeah,
Ghibli and I love all those things from Japan and I love K-dramas and I love K-pop. And so I want to be able to, like connect with all these different like fun things from each of them and appreciate them.
yeah, fun. Well, and it's kind of cool that in doing that, your friends who are not Asian,
Hmm.
can be exposed to not only the Chinese culture, but
Of
many
course.
other Asian cultures
Hmm.
just because you're so interested in it.
Yeah, and if I had to give any suggestions to people who are kind of like antsy or kind of nervous
Hmm.
about getting into that conversation, don't be embarrassed, Like I've had friends who ask me like, "So, what ethnicity are you?" And I said that I'm half white and I'm half Taiwanese. And they're like, "Oh, half Taiwanese, how interesting. Do you speak?" And then they realize, "What does Taiwan speak?" And they're like, "Taiwanese?" I'm like, no, I do not speak Taiwanese. Taiwanese is a language, but I speak mostly Mandarin because Mandarin is the primary language of Taiwan. I'm like, oh, okay. It's not hard to tell people.
Yeah.
It's not like I would never, judge someone for not understanding or knowing, and I would never say, how could you not know that
Mhm.
Taiwan speaks Mandarin?
Yeah.
I never want to put anybody down for that because I want to encourage people questioning these questions.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm really excited when people ask me those kinds of questions.
Well, and Taiwan also speaks their own Taiwanese dialect,
Right.
and Popo is actually from mainland China, so you
Right.
technically you're a quarter Taiwanese and a
Yeah.
quarter
Yeah.
Chinese, and then a half everything Anglo-Saxon. So, yeah, it's I think it's good that you invite people to ask questions.
Hmm.
I think that for a lot of people who are full Asian, the question of being, where are you from, even though they might have grown up in this country and their parents grew up in
Hmm.
this country, it's just that constant feeling of, I guess I'm never from here just because I look Asian.
Hmm.
It's like, if America is a melting pot, why can't the melting pot include Asians and every other race?
Yeah, that rift is definitely very real, and it's kind of unfortunate, for some
Yeah.
people out there. Because, like I said before, I'm in my early 20s, and this is kind of like the classic identity crisis age. So that I'm sure I have plenty of Chinese friends and Japanese friends who were born here, and they definitely feel a special connection to, like their mother country and whatnot, because it's like where their parents are from, or maybe where their grandparents are from. But they also, feel connection to the place they were literally raised. However, there's that problem of people always putting you in the position of the foreigner, even though you're born here and your parents are born here too.
Yeah.
So it's definitely like a much bigger struggle for a lot of my, peers who have to deal with that. And, that's just part of the reason why I think it's so important that people try and educate themselves about, like, you know, if you were raised here in America, that might not necessarily mean that you just happen to be fluent in Chinese already.
Right. Well, this being AAPI month,
Mhm.
and a lot of conversations are happening, and some are really good ones. Like this one is just easy and
Mhm.
fun. Some are hard conversations.
Mhm.
The movement to stop Asian hate
Oh,
and the
it's a good
attacks
one.
against
Yeah.
Asians. We won't go into that, but I like that we're having the conversations and bringing awareness to our heritage and
Mhm.
everything that we've contributed to in this country. um, that we don't want to continue to be invisible in any way,
Mhm.
but we're just as complex as
Yeah.
other Americans are,
Yeah.
right? Like you're not just, one thing, neither am I. So,
Mhm.
what do you hope for the future? Speaking of future,
Mhm.
like in education specifically, since we were talking about that earlier, what do you hope education will look like?
I hope education will be a lot more personable because in terms of educating, whatever age it may be, K through 12, a lot of cultural education is often like about it always kind of feels like people are cherry picking the things that they're most excited to teach children. So, for example, like this is called a chi pao. It's a Chinese dress, and it was designed in like the 1800s and whatnot. And that's wonderful, and those are beautiful things. But I really think it's important that people address the more personable issues that we have to deal with every day. Because I love hearing about people's heritage and like what is the most exciting touristy part about their heritage. But I also want to hear about what is a South Korean teenager's relationship with a Japanese teenager
Hmm.
because things that are as specific as that are much more relevant to somebody who's trying to learn about these things. It's like you have, let's say, a South Korean teenager loves anime, but they feel this inner conflict because they know that there's a really big cultural rift between Japan and South Korea right now because of the really uncomfortable and ugly history during World War II. And that's a really interesting crisis that people could really delve into and explain to kids my age, kids,
Yeah.
like kids even who are even younger and stuff. And whatever way that could be incorporated into a curriculum, it might be a little bit uncomfortable at first because it doesn't seem to fit with everybody else's way of educating, but it's important.
Yeah.
It's
Like
very important.
address it straight on and
Hmm.
then make sure that it doesn't have to be passed on in some
Yeah,
way.
no,
Yeah.
that's the most important part. It's just
Yeah.
about education and teaching everybody that your neighbor is your neighbor and they're not just the Chinese person that moved in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for spending some time with mommy to talk about this. I hope you guys learned something or it maybe raised some more questions. And if it did, just ask me or
Always ask
Angela.
questions.
Yeah. All right. Have fun.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.